history's a little different. So, science, some classes are easier to record or better to record. Some don't really lend themselves to that. So, all right. Before we jump right in, I told you last week that we will we'll have a discussion of a quote each week. So I'm going to read this quote, give you a minute to think it over, and then if you have some thoughts on it, you feel free to share. All right, Tolstoy said this: "If you make it a habit not to blame others, you will feel the growth of the ability to love in your soul, and you will see the growth of goodness in your life." Say it again. If you make it a habit not to blame others, you will feel the growth of the ability to love in your soul, and you will see the growth of goodness in your life. Any thoughts?
It's pretty interesting.
Interesting, why? What makes it interesting?
Seems pretty true.
Seems true to you?
Yeah, like I was, studying the homework that you sent, and Tolstoy and his wife weren't super nice to each other all the time, and that's interesting because he had experience with blaming other people.
Yes, he did.
And then he's like, maybe I should make a quote about this.
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe other people should know about this.
So he doesn't seem to be just taking this quote by itself. If you didn't know who Tolstoy was, you would assume something about him. But reading a little bit of his overview of his life, in particular with his wife, we see that this is not necessarily something he practiced.
Yeah.
Good. Other thoughts? Quiet day after lunch, no thoughts. Yeah. So how many of you make it a practice to blame others? Some of us, yeah. Some of us, we do. That's what we do. How many of you ever blamed others? It's all their fault, right? Everyone has siblings here, so I think everyone's hands probably go up pretty quickly. That's something you learn pretty early as a child, right? It says this: "We will feel the growth of the ability to love in your soul." What do you think that means in particular? To feel the growth of the ability to love.
Just to feel a deeper love than you usually would. It's a
Deeper.
person or something.
Yeah. The ability to feel a deeper love. Why? What do you think blame here? I mean, he's talking about blaming. So what do you think blaming does within your own soul in its ability to demonstrate love or grow in love?
If you blame someone, you're obviously angry.
Yeah.
So if you try not to blame other people, that can help you feel less angry, I guess.
Good. And it continues. And you will see the growth of goodness in your life. So he's making a direct correlation between not blaming others and having good things, good experiences in life. So having a perspective that doesn't point the finger keeps you pretty steady in walking. By the way, I've shared this quote with your parents as well to maybe have some conversations around that. There's this reminds me of a particular story in the Bible where there were two individuals that were created. Well, one was created originally, the other was taken from his side, his rib. And do you remember what happens to Adam at the very outset when God comes down in the garden and after they've sinned, and what does Adam say?
It's the woman that you gave.
It was the woman that you gave me, right? This is the condition of fallen man, is to blame others. And so we see here, and I think, Hannah, you point out really well, it's something that we're actually going to talk about today, kind of the dual nature of who Tolstoy was. You see quotes like this, and you would think, I mean, this is a man who has some wisdom, some real insight, and that is certainly true. What we also know about his life is he was a very tortured soul. He had to battle very much so with both his good nature and this struggle that he had within him. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And so I have shared with you guys again, we'll kind of moving forward a folder of documents. In this, I have already taken the notes from today's teaching, and so you will have that for reference to look over. I would still encourage you to take handwritten notes because that's going to be part of your final exam here, is to be looking through those. And starting next week, I'm going to have you hand them in first thing in class because we're going to have some actual writing prompts to work with. And so as we're looking at writing and thinking in terms of who authors are, authors generally have to write from a very specific framework of understanding. How many of you have ever heard about the 6 questions you need to ask in order to kind of frame something out?
Who, what, when, where, how, whatever.
Yes. Who, what, where, when, how, why. 6 questions. That basically frames out for us, helps us to understand or be able to verbalize anything, whether it's communication just from standing up in front of people, whether it's writing something down, whether it's writing a fictional story, right? We talked about this last week, the who in the stories that you guys are kind of generating or writing, right? The person's name carries significance. The what they do, the what is going on with it, why are they motivated to do those things? How do they go about doing those things? Where? And we're going to talk about that in just a minute here, how that shaped Tolstoy's life. But really quickly, in your little journals, this is the first journal entry. I want you to answer this question for me. Where are you from? Now, before you answer that in one word, I want to give you a challenge. You are not to use the specific place you were born. So I don't want any proper nouns. I want you to describe in detail. And so if I had no comprehension of Texas or California or Washington or wherever else, I want you to use imagery to talk about. It could be your childhood home, and so explain to me what your childhood home looks like. It could be you could be more poetic, and it could be like a season. So you could talk about like the leaves that are falling or whatever, or you could even talk about like other senses, smells, sights, things that you experienced. So I'm going to give you just a minute to do that.
I have a question.
Sure.
I don't really remember where I was born because we moved to California pretty soon after that.
Sure. Yeah. And so maybe your earliest childhood memory, where you consider yourself from. And so for you, maybe it's not something that you understand firsthand, but you might have to bank on the memories of your parents. So maybe it's something that your parents have talked about.
But we're supposed to do like the place we were.
Where are you from? And that's up to you. I mean, you can determine where you were from was where you were born. It could be where you first have childhood memories.
And you just want detail on what that looks like.
Yeah, I want a couple of sentence detail without using a specific place.
So I don't even say Texas.
Texas is a proper noun, so leave the proper nouns out. I'm interested.
Literally just have to do that.
I-
Say the hospital?
You could say the hospital. But more than just saying the hospital, detail the hospital to me. Are you aware of the hospital? Were you physically there? And when you opened your eyes as a newborn baby and you looked around, do you remember what that looked like? Okay, so then you would have to describe that as an imagination of what you think that would be like. Because you're not going to be able to offer me any firsthand knowledge. That's a good question, though.
Can I give hints to kind of where I were, like the weather and how it would be?
Sure. Yep.
We're gonna do like a guessing game?
No, we don't need to play the guessing game. I want you guys, again, this is a practice. Part of the reason that we're doing some of this creative writing is as we're studying what it is to be an author or to understand the mindset of Tolstoy, we want to kind of think like an author thinks. Because whether we know it or not, everything that Tolstoy wrote is framed in large part by the life that he lived. It is yours. All right, let's wrap that up. Yeah, it's okay if you're not done. You can finish this as homework over the next week. All right, who is brave enough to share?
I can't.
Elijah?
So I think you guys know where all those are from, so I just did. I am from where the cowboys roam, and the rattlesnakes call home, where a backyard pool is a sanctuary from the burning sun to keep cool.
Good. So we all have a context of that, right? So let's pretend for a second that you didn't know it was from Texas. What would you assume about what he wrote about the place that he was from?
Very hot. It's hot.
It's hot. Yeah, and so is Elijah using a good sense of imagery to give you an understanding of what he was, where he was from? So likely some of his earliest memories are of it being hot. It's warm now. We see some imagery of like animals that were there, so that might give us context. If we didn't know exactly it was from Texas, we might be able to narrow it down to a place with snakes, a hot place with snakes, so we can narrow it down. All right, somebody else want to share? Okay. Oh, be brave.
I can't. I didn't finish mine.
Oh, it's not finished. Do you want to share what you started on?
It won't. You won't understand.
That won't make sense. Okay.
Yeah, it won't.
Good. I need at least one more volunteer, or you'll be voluntold. Great. Thank you, Benji.
I was about to say I was.
I sensed that you were ready to share with us.
It might not make sense at the end, that's
No worries.
where the evergreens sway in the cool wind of the evening, as I looked out towards the waters just over the bluff. I sat there on my tricycle through spring, summer, and winter, waiting to see snow in the mountains.
Good. Very good use of imagery. All right, so this is an artistic device that most authors use, right? Where we are from, or how we perceive where we are from, are very important. So this afternoon, we're going to talk about origins. What were Tolstoy's origins? Now, I told you that we're not going to memorize dates, but you need to know that he was born on August 28, 1828. Why do you need to know that? Well, this is the reason why. That's 200 years ago, right?
I have that down.
1828.
Yeah, 1828. Roughly 200 years ago. And so more than knowing the specific date of it, how much do you think culture has changed in 200 years? Quite a bit. We've talked about this before. Let's give some context. How long have we had smartphones?
10, 12 years.
Yeah, 15,
For a
20,
few decades.
not even 20 years yet. Now think about it. How long have we had cell phones? Well, for the common person, not much sooner before
20
we had
years.
smartphones.
20 years.
Yeah, so 20, 25 years. Right, so a lot has changed. In fact, when we think about a little over 100 years ago, we didn't have automobiles. We certainly didn't have airplanes and airports and all of this. So times have changed radically. They're radically different, right? And so he lived in a different place, in a different time. And so it's important for us, if we're going to understand the context of who he was, to have some backdrop from it. Because how many of you know, have a really deep understanding of Russia? Like you know the places and the people, right? That's just, even now, that's a huge cultural difference in what's going on. And yet what we can miss sometimes, culturally speaking, is that people that live all across the world will describe things in similar ways that you live. When they think about home or where they were from, it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. You may have some positive thoughts, like you guys both use positive imagery. If you grew up in difficult circumstances, you might have some really negative imagery. But we all can relate to one place of safety, despite how difficult our life is. Can you guys think of that one place that you remember having the fondest thoughts? It could be where you live here and now. For Tolstoy, that place was called Yasnaya Polyana.
Yeah, that right.
I remember learning
You guys
about
remember hearing about that or reading about that?
that. Yeah, and he lived most of his life there.
I forget.
Most of his
He was
life.
born 100 miles from
Moscow.
Moscow.
Yeah, Moscow. But this is a place, it's called, that means the clear glade. And so this was the place that he had his fondest childhood memories, but it was also the place where he experienced his greatest tragedies. But for him, this was the anchoring point for him. He wrote some of his best-known novels there. But it was the one place in his life where he seemed to find some level of comfort or refuge or solace. And this is going to be an important theme throughout his life, because as we will see, even as we discussed this morning, that Tolstoy will experience some really high highs and some really extreme lows. And his life is kind of bookended by some really difficult tragedies. In fact, you could say, in part, that Tolstoy's life was a life that was marked by death. And so, interestingly enough, in many ways, the book that you guys will be reading will be a reflection. And he wrote this obviously before he died, but will be a reflection on the way he lived and the way he died. And so this book will help us to understand a little bit more of the full context of who Tolstoy was. Now, do you guys remember, and I'm sorry, I've taken in a lot of information here, and so I don't remember if it was on the homework or not. Did anything in your studies this week talk about the green stick? The green stick, all right. And so this was a kind of a tale that was told within the Tolstoy family. In fact, this is directly tied to Yasnaya Polyana. It was told, the story was told to him by his oldest brother, Nikolai. And so the story kind of goes like this. There is a magic green stick that is hidden. That's what the story is told, that is hidden around Yasnaya Polyana. And so Nikolai would tell his siblings all of this, that if you go out and search and you find this green stick, when you find it, on the stick, it will be given to you the secret to make all humans happy. Now, this was pretty instrumental for Tolstoy, because if I told you that story now, how many of you would believe that there is some green stick that is there, and it's nobody? Just me, I guess. My hand's the only one that. You might, right? How many of you would like the thought of that you could find some object, like a green stick, and you would solve all the world's, right? So the thought of it, right, is kind of a romantic thought. It's something that is hopeful. And so even if you know, right, that there's not some magical stick out there, there's a part of us in the human condition that wants to grasp something or have something to hold to that could really become this thing. Now again, this is 200 years ago. And so there's no like, hey Google, is there such thing as a green stick and where do I find it, right? There's no information that he can look up or look for. And so we're dealing with, at a time culturally, where the ability to tell stories are really powerful. The imagery that we use, and we would explain stories hopeful stories through tales like this. Now, up until even years before his life ends, Tolstoy held on to the belief that there was this magic stick somewhere on the property that he would end up owning. He was hopeful. It was foolish to put his hope in a stick. But he was hopeful. And again, this would paint a picture for us of really his life. One that is marked, again, by death, but one that is marked about a grasping for some kind of hope, some kind of magic cure, some kind of thing that would do what? Bring happiness to the world. Not just happiness to the world, but truly, here Tolstoy is looking for happiness to himself. Last week we talked about this quote. And it's the most significantly attributed quote to Tolstoy. Again, it says this: "There can be only one permanent revolution, a moral one, the regeneration of the inner man." How is this revolution to take place? Nobody knows how it will take place in humanity, but every man feels it clearly in himself. And yet, in our world, everybody thinks of changing humanity, and nobody thinks of changing himself. You see, we have a tremendous amount of insight into the life of Tolstoy with these couple quotes that we have talked about already today. There's this inner struggle, right? He is talking here about the own need to have regeneration within his own soul. And what he can't seem to shake, as it would seem in his life, is the world into which he was born, which was tragic, difficult. Although he was better off than many of his contemporaries, the experiences that he experienced radically shaped him, and he struggled throughout his whole life. And the primary thing that he was looking for throughout his whole life was really a connection to being loved. And he idealized what that love should look like.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think because of his experience in the war, is that what made him write sadder stories or even more indecent? Is that
Oh, yeah.
his experience?
War and
Yeah.
Peace.
So I remember he despised war.
He did.
He hated violence.
Yes, and interestingly enough, yeah, I mean, let's just let's answer that question. How many of you, if you had to experience war today, would you think you would come out with a really negative feeling towards that?
Yes.
Right, that's
Probably.
probably. But no, his life, even before he got to war, was shaped with tragedy. Today we're going to talk about, and really throughout all of the biography, historically speaking, what we're going to be talking about is called lived experiences. You have a history. Your history is told in your lived experience. There's only one person in your life that can truly, fully describe what your life is like. That's yourself, right? It's not just what happens to you, but it's how you interpret what has happened to you. Because there's many people, as we'll find out, who experienced the very same wars that he experienced, who didn't have the perspectives that he had. There's many of his contemporaries, and we'll talk about this as well, Dostoevsky being one of them, that had many similarities, but the way that their mind perceived things and how they wrote, and how they tried to address the problems that they both experienced, become radically different. Thinking in the context of your own families right now, do you guys think and feel and act the same way that all of your siblings do? Or are there pretty radical differences, right? And so for all of us, if you grow up in a family and you experience change, like moving, or a death in the family, or a birth in the family, or something, right? The way that you interpret that is going to be different. Now, this is important for us as we're telling the story and understanding the story of Tolstoy, because ultimately, the what happens in the where. So, the where is a really big anchoring point to how we become the people that we are. Where Tolstoy was born was significant. And we will see that because He was born in a time where Russia was going to experience some convulsions of war and revolution. He was born into a very particular season of time. And where he was born into, again, is this idea of heaven on earth, Yasnaya Polyana, the place of refuge, and there is a world that's outside of it. Now, I think we can all relate to that in some form or fashion. So I had you do this really brief journal entry of your earliest memories. Tolstoy actually had a saying here, a quote from a journal entry that wasn't widely published. He says this: "Here are my first recollections." And he's talking here about being a baby. Now again, when you're born and you're a baby, you don't have the ability to remember thought up until a certain age, which is like years after you're born.
Yeah,
So,
like 4 or 5
right.
or something.
Yeah. And so he is again using an author's illustrative mind to try to explain for us the difficulties he's experiencing in life. And so he's saying, here are my first recollections. Well, that's not really a true statement because he couldn't have recalled these things. And so he's imagining what he was like when he was a baby. I am bound up. I want to free my hands, and I cannot do it. Talking about being swaddled and pinned down, so to speak. There were people bent over me. I do not remember who they were, and it all happened in semi-darkness. But I do remember that there were 2 of them. They are worried by my cries, but do not unbind me. Now, who do you think the 2 people are?
His parents.
His parents. Yeah, it's probably a pretty good guess, and it's significant that we understand that because he's writing this much further down in his life. They're worried by my cries, but they do not unbind me, which I want them to do, and therefore I cry even louder. It seems that for them it is necessary, and I want to prove it to them, and I indulge in crying that repels me, but which it's uncontainable. And so he's talking about now, he's crying, and he's bound up, and he wants them to release him, but they won't release him because, parents don't just give in to babies, right? Like parents don't negotiate with terrorists. That's what babies are. They want to get their way, right? Throw a fit. They're not negotiating with the terrorist that wants its way.
Like, fine, get what I
Right,
want.
but they're disciplining his soul here. And yet his earliest childhood memories are wanting to indulge in the flesh. Now we don't want to miss this. It's an important lesson here to learn. This is human nature. We want to cast off restraint. We want to cast away that which is meant to hinder us to a certain degree, not to keep us from having freedom, but to keep us safe. I feel the injustice and cruelty not of people because they pity me, but of fate and pity for myself. And so now he's having this recollection that not only saying, well, it really wasn't them that was the issue. It was going on with inside me, and I pitied myself at this point. And so he's looking back on his childhood and feeling sorry for himself. He continues. I do now know and shall never know. I do not now know or never shall know what that was about. But it is certain that was the first and most powerful impression of my life. And what is memorable is not my cries or my suffering, but the complex, contradictory nature of the impression. So it's not the things that happened, but it was the things that was written on his heart. This difficulty, this challenge, this struggle that he's experiencing again, imagining himself as a very young child, contending with this difficulty of wanting freedom but being hindered. He finishes saying this: I want freedom. It won't harm anyone, and yet they keep torturing me. Now again, think about this, the quote that we started with, right, about blaming others. He's blaming them right out of the outset, right? He just wants freedom. And it wouldn't hurt them, doesn't harm them if they unbind me. It wouldn't harm them to let me free and do what I want. But they keep torturing me. Now this is called, what he's using is called hyperbole. He's overstating a point. Were they actually torturing him? No. But from his impression, right, it's the worst day ever. You guys ever experienced that with a young child? Like you tell them no, they can't have that, and it's like the worst thing that
And they
ever happened.
explode.
And yeah, right. This is why we don't negotiate with terrorists. Yeah,
Can I use the restroom?
yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
That's also kind of interesting is babies
Yeah.
get swaddled because so they won't scratch their face.
Right, so they won't scratch them. Right, so there's a purpose and a reason to bring comfort. The parents are trying to bring comfort to young Leo, or Lev, as he was also called.
Because Russian. I had a question about that because on the books it said Lev Tolstoy, and I was like, wait, they were saying Leo Tolstoy, and then I was reading on some of the homework page, like on Google Drive they put on there, and it said that it was like Leo Tolstoy, also known as Count Lev. Really long word, Tolstoy. And they're like because he's Russian, but if you translate it to English, it's most likely Leo.
Leo, yeah.
So that was
And also
interesting.
in like, which is true with most cultures, and particularly in Russian culture, they would have a name, but they would also have a pet name that they give their family. And so you would see their formalized name and their pet name, nicknames, right? We all can identify with that. And so he closes here, I want freedom, it won't harm anyone, and yet they keep torturing me. They pity me, and they tie me up, and I, who needs everything, am weak, and they are strong. Now, we may miss this stuff when we kind of read through it, but I want to encourage you, as we're historically studying any person's life, what we have to be careful of is not just looking at the events of their life and putting into their life our opinions of what our society looks like and interpreting through the lens of what we experience today. This is probably the worst mistake that people are making currently when it comes to historical things, is that we look back 200 years and say, well, this is what they should have thought, and this is what they should have felt, and this is what they should have done. That's the very thing we have to avoid. What we want to do here is really try to understand and put ourselves in the position of Tolstoy. What is he experiencing? Because as Hannah rightly pointed out, he was not a good man by a certain measure. He wasn't a perfect man. But does that mean that we can't learn a tremendous amount of value about the world that was shaped around his time? That we can't learn a tremendous amount even about our own selves? Because one thing that is for certain is the way that Tolstoy wrote, and one of the reasons why we're even having a study about him, a biographical study, or why people talk about him, or why he's considered one of the greatest authors of all time, was, in spite of his failings as a person, he had a tremendous amount of insight into how we as people function and how we function in the sense of community. And it's born out of some of this inner struggle that we see within himself. But why did Tolstoy struggle so much? What was it about his life that made him become the person he was? Well, the primary answer to that question was something very significant happened to him at 2 years old.
His dad died.
Not his dad.
His mom died.
Wait, I
first.
got it mixed up then.
Yeah, his mom.
His mom died first too.
His mom died at 2 years old.
Then his dad died when he was
He was
9.
9.
I have mixed up.
Yeah, pretty significant. Now, I think everyone in this room has their parents, right? Nobody here has had to deal with the death of a parent. That's a hard thought to think about, and yet all of us, if we're honest, have probably dealt with grief in some form or fashion from some family member. At 2 years old, do you think that rationally in his mind he thought, "Where's Mummy? Where's my mom gone?" No. But what is happening here, right, is not just what's happening in the physical realm. There's things that are happening within the soul of the inner man and the spirit, right? And what Tolstoy did throughout the rest of his life was he kind of had this picture of his mom. And in fact, most biographers talk about this. Like, he didn't have like literal pictures of his mom except for like some like silhouetted picture. And so he had this idealized sense of who his mother was and would be and how she loved him. Now that was a lot of danger in that, because he held everyone up to this standard of what love should look like. Through really, I mean, he didn't really know his mom. He knew stories about his mom. We understand that his mom loved him deeply, that actually he was one of the favorites. But that was all kind of secondhand. Well, and that can be told secondhand through a couple of different ways. Again, let's try to imagine ourselves in that position. Imagine you're one of your parents having a favorite child and you're not them. What do you think your siblings would tell you?
They probably
The favorite child. What would the favorite child say to you? Go ahead, Kate.
say to me.
Yeah, what do you think the favorite child would say to you if they knew they were the favorite and you weren't?
I don't know. It depends on what kind of person they are.
It would depend on what kind of person they were, yeah.
Give me an example on a person that.
Well, what if they weren't a very good person?
Well, then they probably rub it in.
They'll probably rub it in. Right, and so he has to live through this prism or this lens, not of what he has seen or necessarily what he's experienced, but kind of secondhand knowledge. But what we know is that he was left with this really deep longing throughout his life, a really deep longing for love and affection, particularly that of maternal love. Now, as luck would have it, right, Tolstoy had the opportunity to have his dad around for a few more years. The problem is that his dad was not necessarily a really good man either. He wasn't teaching young Lev how to live in the context of the culture or the world around him. His dad was often out suing other people, trying to make money through lawsuits, or out doing other things. He was kind of like absent. And then we fast forward 7 more years, and then we see that his dad has died. And so the very first memory that he has here, as he's talking about his recollections, are talking about these two people. These two people that hovered over him. Now, why is this important? Because he's writing this not from the innocence of a child just dealing with normal parental things, but he's interpreting on this entry the abandonment that he feels because they died. The rejection that he feels because they're not there to nurture him and love him. And yet he feels great anguish and great pain because he wants to be loved. He wants to do something of value. He wants to see something of beauty. And yet there's this ugliness, and he refers to this often. There's this ugliness inside of him that tends to take over. And he lives his life really fighting these two thoughts of war and peace. So why do we have such a profound author? Because it's somebody who has wrestled with some really deep and profound questions. This is the way he envisioned himself. And in reality, what he experienced in life was he was an orphan. Right? He had other family members that he loved, that were kind of around, but even those family members died. Outside of one aunt, Toinette, that he was fond of, who lived a little bit longer life. But what was the one anchoring thing? All of these people dying, but as fortune would have it, years later he would inherit Yasnaya Polyana. And so this place where he lived would be the thing that kind of marked beauty in his life. It would be the absolute perfect representation of beauty. And he would imagine what life would be like if his mom had never died, and how she would love him and be around him, and how his life would have changed. But because he put on this image, right? He took on this identity of being an orphan. Because you don't have to be an orphan even if you are orphaned, right? You don't have to be a victim even if you were victimized. You don't have to be the labels of things that the world gives you even though you experience those things. And Tolstoy was faced with the question, Could he deal with the inner man, the regeneration of his soul, or was he going to continue to walk out this path that life had kind of handed him? He became very shy and sensitive. Makes sense, right? People that are around you have passed. The two people that you loved the most, that you thought, looking back, hindered you and didn't give you freedom. And so there's not even a resolution there in life with them. You can't like talk that out and figure it out and work it out.
I noticed he lived a lot longer than his family.
He did.
92.
Yeah, he lived quite.
Well, I
He
thought
lived
it
quite.
was 82.
He lived quite a long time,
92 or?
and he lived a
I don't
very,
remember.
as we know, right?
Oh yeah, it was 82.
He lived a very sad life towards the end.
Oh wait.
Anyway.
He was longing for, so these are important things to understand, coming from this orphan mindset, shy and sensitive. So he withdrew away from the world, in large part. Why? Because he didn't want to get close to you. He was very sensitive. Well, rightfully so. He longed for love, especially the idealized love of his mother. He was very passionate. In fact, he would talk about how ultimately he feels like the problem with mankind is that mankind gives over to all of their passions, things that they love, and it consumes them. We'll close at this part here. Just have about 20 more minutes with another journal entry. And he's going to talk about here ultimately what this passionate life, he actually calls it the disorderly life, of what that stems from. And again, we want to be very, very careful. I want to encourage you as we're reading this to not be judgmental of Tolstoy. In spite of all of his bad choices, they were motivated for a reason. And the reason I brought up even that quote about blaming others, that's basically what judgment is. We can look back on history again and point the finger at him, what he could have done better, should have done better, how he should have lived. Well, that's not the lessons all that Tolstoy is going to give us. In fact, he's going to give us a really good example of what not to do and how not to fall prey to that very same device. Brother Emmanuel talks about this on our Tuesday meetings, right? The orphan spirit is at play in the life of Tolstoy. He will never fully come to grasp that. He will wrestle with it in a very fleshly, earthly way. But he says this, again, a tremendous amount of wisdom and insight. I've come to clearly see that the disorderly life that the majority of fashionable people take to be a consequence of youth is nothing other than a consequence of the early corruption of the soul. And so, again, here, he's not talking about a disorderly life coming from one's silly youth, but he's talking about something that is clearly different. The corruption of the soul. Now for him, he believed that the primary factor and reason for the corruption of his soul was the death of his mother. So what can we learn from that? How do we, as individuals, interpret the historical events in our lives? We can process things as being good, as being truly good things, and look at them from a positive lens. We could have go to really one extreme where we ignore any of the difficulties and only paint a picture of it being good, right? We could respond to things that occur in our life with a very negative outlook and go the whole opposite way and see things as absolutely just worst case scenarios. And this could be like the why is this happening to me? We've likely experienced both sides of that spectrum. We've been overly optimistic where we push away the realities, and we've been overly pessimistic where we've pushed away the realities. And yet what we want to do, again, is to live with the prism historically understanding this, one that is objective. Was there good reason for Tolstoy's life to be marred and difficult? Yeah, he experienced some real trauma, some real difficulty at a very young age. And at 2 years old, again, you don't cognitively understand it, but emotionally and spiritually there's things going on. He didn't have anyone to help him navigate that world. This would be important because all of Tolstoy's writings at the very center talk about family and community. And it really is about wrestling with these concepts. And in many ways, he's authoring books to help bring some sense of resolution to his own life. He continues, let a man withdraw from society. Let him retreat into himself, and his reason will soon cast aside the spectacles which showed him everything in distorted form, and his views of things will become so clear that he will be unable to understand how he's not seen it before. And so his answer to this idea of the disorderly life is to push away everything outside of you and to retreat within and to cast all things aside. His answer was to become intellectual, to let reason do its work, and it will indicate to you your destiny and will give you rules with which you can confidently enter society. From your reason, so that it would be coherent with the whole, the source of everything, and not with the part, i.e. the society of people. Then the society, as a part, won't have an influence on you. It is easier to write 10 volumes of philosophy than to put one single principle into practice. Now, this would be a defining truth in his life. He made tremendous quotes, and yet he had a difficulty putting the single practice into his own life.
I'd say if you write a quote, you should be following what you do before writing it.
Sure.
Work on it in your own life before
You should, right?
you tell other people to do it. Yeah.
Sure, and I would not disagree with that, except what we want to be very careful of is again trying to simply or merely live from a moral principle, doing what's right because it's right. Now, the better thing that we're after is following a very distinct pattern of wisdom. The source of that wisdom is important. Tolstoy here talks about reason. He's gonna retreat from society and think it through, get in his own mind, begin to create his own thoughts. Well, did that outcome, is the fruit of his life demonstrate for us that him going inwardly has really produced something? Well, no, he had a lot of really good quotes, and there's wisdom there, but his life didn't bear out that reality, did it? So we can look at his life and say, the way that he practiced trying to overcome these obstacles was not a good way for us to practice. We can't simply assent to an understanding or a reasoning to come at some level of answer. It's not even in doing the right things, being moral, because the problem with people who only focus on morality is they become like the Bible talks about them, the Pharisees, right? You remember those types, right? Well, you're supposed to do this way and that way, and you become very legalistic. And those types of people do what? They judge others. Well, there's got to be a higher perspective of wisdom, or something that should be central to our lives. That should be the thing that motivates and maneuvers us through, right? It's not our own thinking about what is right or wrong. It's not our own ability to navigate the problems of life. See, this is what Tolstoy experienced was he didn't have a guide to really help him. And so he had to rely upon himself. Now, hopefully what you will find is that your lives are marked with a pretty radical difference. Because hopefully what you guys understand or come to understand is that you have a great many people surrounding you that desire to help you navigate the difficulties of life. And God forbid those be as difficult as Tolstoy did. See, ultimately, the disorderly life, number one, made Tolstoy discuss this whole consequence of early corruption of the soul. This was the problem that life presented Tolstoy with. And so you see in his writings, what is he trying to do? He's trying to answer this question of the corruption of the soul. How do we deal with corruption of the soul? How do we navigate through it? And so he tells these stories like War and Peace, which is a struggle of the corruption of the soul. Right? This is why he disdains. He'll later go on to disdain war. Not merely because war is the killing of one person to another, but because there's something that is foundationally, from his perspective, broken within the soul of man. He'll write books like Anna Karenina, which talks about divorce, which again will deal with this perversion or corruption of the soul in the life of a woman who leaves her family to pursue other things. We'll talk about it in the death of Ivan Ilyich.
I think one of those videos might have told a little bit about one of those books.
Yeah, and hopefully what you're getting with those things is a really broad overview. So when we're talking about things, we're not just skipping through dates and times, but you can kind of have a general understanding of who he was, and hopefully I'll be able to each week kind of flesh out more specific details. But the purpose, again, of this study is not just a historical look at his life, but all history is intended to look through from this prism, that we can learn from it. We can learn from the cultures that came before us, the people that came before us, and that we can process life differently. Tolstoy, secondly, believed that truth is self-evident for a person who is independent from the corrupting influence of society. Tolstoy believed that a person who withdraws from society, that truth would just come to them. Now, this is true in part, is it not? We want to be separated from what? The world. Right? You guys might have heard this saying before in Christian circles, right? You are in the world, but not of it. We talk about things about being a set-apart people. Well, this is not too different than what Tolstoy's after, except Tolstoy's answer was separate so you can use your logic. But even in Tolstoy's time, there's kind of this pushback against cultural influence. In fact, a lot of what was happening in Russian culture at the time was a pushback against this world power that was coming on the scene, that was becoming very individualistic, and that was the United States of America. It really was Western thinking. Russian thinking tends to be more Eastern thinking. And so some of what began to infiltrate into Russian thought around the time of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, Pushkin, all of these other pretty significant Russian figures, was this Western ideal of individualism. Now, Tolstoy is pushing back against that. This ultimately leads Tolstoy to an internal struggle in which he wants to both enter society because he feels ostracized and shy because of what's happened to him, and he wants to mend society. He wants to fix it. Now remember what that first quote we talked about is: everyone thinks about changing humanity and no one thinks about changing themselves. Was Tolstoy, now let's think about this, was Tolstoy saying that quote as somebody who had figured out, no, I just need to change myself? No, he was the guy who was trying to change humanity. He was trying to change through literature, through understanding, through retreating to your mind to give you a different way or a pattern of life to live. And yet the problem was that he didn't live it. He hadn't wrestled through it that much. And so why is the outcome of Tolstoy's life such a negative one? Well, the very thing that he feared, it's not contending or dealing with the soul. And he rightly recognized that the sooner that we can come to an understanding of dealing with the soul, with the inner man, the regeneration of the inner man, the better trajectory that your individual life will be, and that your ability to change yourself will have on what? Humanity. So why is Tolstoy so well known? Because this guy was brilliant in his understanding of the human condition. He did a very poor job in walking that out. And so we have a tremendous amount. If we properly understand it, we can have a tremendous amount of influence that he can give into our lives, as even being somebody who didn't live life really well, because he observed life really well. But ultimately, this is where we leave it. Tolstoy believed that philosophy, right? You can write 10 good things, but if you can't live it out, that philosophy is only useful if it serves practical needs. It doesn't matter what you know. It doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what you believe unless you put it into practice. In fact, I can tell you a great deal about what you believe based on how you live. If we reflect on that truth in Tolstoy's life, we will see that he didn't have a real anchor to these things that he said. Or we can interpret it through the lens of there were moments of bright spots in his life where he really got it. And maybe he experienced the divine in those moments. Maybe God really truly revealed to him some things about himself and mankind. And yet what he failed to do was to follow through on those lessons that he was given. You and I have the opportunity every day to learn and to grow and to respond appropriately. The question is, again, will we choose to in our lived experience? I will point out again to all of us that these are the very things that we talk about week in and week out, not in history class, but amongst our community. How is culture shaped? Culture is shaped by the lived experience of its people. Why should we, going back to this quote, make it a habit not to blame others? Well, we should just throw that out because Tolstoy didn't believe it and he said it. Well, no, he said it rightly. He missed the mark. So how do we make sure that we hold true to this mark? Because I think this is true. We will fill the growth of the ability to love in our soul. Now, this was important to Tolstoy, the ability to love. If he truly experienced that, right? And he would point his finger less, he would experience love more. What was he longing for? Love. The problem was he was, as Hannah said, pointing the finger at his wife primarily. Why didn't he see growth of goodness in his life? He didn't practice. He didn't practice what he preached. And so, I want you to reflect upon this. There was a pastor some years ago. I really like this quote. He said this: "Your existence is evidence that this generation needs something your life contains." So the fact that you are here and that you're drawing breath is proof that the culture that you're in, the generation that you're in, the people that you're around need something from you. The question you have to ask yourself is what am I trying to leave to the world around me? You might be a little too young to think about the legacy that you will leave, but it's an important one. The opportunity is before you today to shape the history in which you will live, to write the story of history, which really is an autobiography. You will respond well or you will respond poorly. What will you do when you respond poorly and it's either brought to your attention or you recognize it within yourself? What will you do when you respond rightly? Because even responding to the good things can have a pretty adverse effect on you. You could become extremely prideful, and that wouldn't be a good outcome. And so this week, for the homework, let's talk about the homework. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to read chapter 1 of the Death of Ivan Ilyich. In fact, I'm going to read the first paragraph, well, technically the first 2 paragraphs, but really quickly, and then I'm going to give you the second part of what you're going to do. Chapter 1. During an interval in the Melvinsky trial in the large building of the law courts, the members and public prosecutor met in Ivan Egrovich Shevak's room, private room, where the conversation turned on the celebrated Krasnovsky case. Fyodor Vasilievich warmly maintained that it was not subject to their jurisdiction. Ivan Egrovich maintained the contrary, while Peter Ivanovich, not having entered into the discussion at the start, took no part in it, but looked through the Gazette, which had just been handed in. "Gentlemen," he said, "Ivan Ilyich has died." like our life's beginnings will shape us. The beginning of what you author, the very beginning of what you author, will hold sway over the rest of what you write. And so this week, thinking about the story you want to write, I want you to write the opening paragraph of your story. What he did really well here was this very last line, because we don't have a lot of context, we don't know who people are, but he says this: gentleman, von Ilyich has died. That enters us into a context of a story. I also want you to think about your own story. As we said here, talked about today, Tolstoy was shaped by his being an orphan. I want you maybe to take some time, and I would encourage you always to reflect on this with your parents, to think about events in your life that have shaped you, for good or not. Because there is a great opportunity for those things that were of great difficulty for you to discipline your soul and to address the spiritual nature of those things. We would say here amongst our people, it's dealing with the orphan spirit. That would have done Mr. Tolstoy a tremendous amount of good. Unfortunately, he didn't have that in his life, but you guys are surrounded, are you not, by people who have insight and wisdom and care and concern for your life, who want to help you navigate those things. Inevitably, I think what this study is going to quickly become is not simply just a look into Tolstoy's life, but really a reflection upon the life that we're living, the history that we're living out in real time, and how that affects the culture around us. Because you, each of you, this generation, your generation, will shape the culture of our people moving forward. Because you will either hear and heed and follow in the path of those who have gone before you as a very real practice, disciplined practice in dealing with the regeneration of the inner man and serving the Father as a son, or you will jump in and out of both worlds, or keep one foot in both worlds and try to navigate both worlds. Or, hopefully not, people will jump completely out of the boat. The hope will be for us, again, continuing forward, that we are mindful of the history that has gone before us, so that we might not make the same mistakes from the past. That's it. Thank you all. I appreciate your diligence. As far as the homework again is reading chapter 1, writing opening paragraph to your story. Again, the review in that first section, biographical overview, there's a lot of information I put in there, and so you can still look through that and write down notes. If you have questions, hopefully we're going to get to some of those questions as we go through. Part of this is meant to just be an independent study, so that you guys, as even Noah's talking about, can learn how to learn on your own and what works best for you. And then we'll certainly have discussions here. If you do have questions or things that you want answered in the class time, let's not just wait for class to start, but please, you can email me, text me, or whatever those particular questions, so that I can make sure that we highlight those throughout the week.
So